Hi, I'm Scott. This is part 3 of a 4-part video series I created to show you how I modified my Arcade1UP cabinet to use the 19-in-1 board that contains lots of classic arcade games that run on a horizontal monitor. This video is part of a series of videos I've created related to the Arcade1UP cabinets. In this video, I'll show you how I attach the JAMMA harness and the power supply from the wall to the power supply and onto the 19-in-1 board, speaker, amplifier, and monitor. Let's get started. All right, a couple comments before I do the JAMMA harness attached to the controls, the buttons and the joystick on the control panel. There's a couple of things you'll need to do. On the internet, you'll want to find, there's a couple sites, I'll put a link in the description, this Jamba Wiring map. So what it does is on the connector for the JAMMA harness, it will tell you there's the part side and the solder side. I'll go over that in just a second. And on the part side, it says here's where these pins, 1 through 28, and what they are supposed to be mapped to. So the software on the 19-in-1 board, it expects responses from certain pins on the JAMMA connector, and then those pins, for example, this is pin 19, will go to the first player joystick to down. So that's how the interface between the buttons and joysticks goes down the JAMMA wiring harness. Based on these pins, it goes into the 19-in-1 hardware, and then that gets converted into a signal that the software will use. So you'll need this. And then I created this cheat sheet. So for this particular control panel, I'm going to have a joystick 1 for player 1, joystick for player 2, and then I've got my test and service buttons, my player 1, player 2 buttons, and then I've got 6 buttons: reverse, hyperspace, Invisio, smart bomb, thrust, and fire on the control panel that I need to map. So I wrote these down, and then I went and determined what down here, these 6 buttons, what are they? And that's buried in documentation. So I'm telling you right here, fire is player 1, switch 1, or player 1, SW1. And then the smart bomb is player 1, SW2. So, and then the thrust is player 1, SW3. So the software is expecting the hardware interface, and therefore the JAMMA harness, and therefore the button. If you want to do a thrust, you're going to press the button associated with P1 switch 3, which is going to be mapped to the thrust button. So I mapped those out. Player 1 switch 4 is reverse. Player 1 switch 5 is hyperspace. Player 1 switch 6 is Invisio, and that's used on Stargate or Defender 2. Now this is tricky. The JAMMA harnesses didn't come out with a switch 6 until later on. And in this particular harness I got from Do-It-Yourself Retro Arcade, switch 6 doesn't have a wire there. It's got the pin and it's empty, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to solder a wire onto that so I can actually hook up the Invisio button to switch 6 for player 1. And I'll show you more about that later. But you need all this. It just makes life easier, and I'll show you why as we keep going through this video. So then I came down here to the JAMMA harn pin for the buttons association with player 1 and player 2. Here's player 1, switch 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which is basically, I'm redoing this, but I'm doing it in switch order, and that tells me which pin. So switch 1 is going to be pin 11, and that's going to be on the parts side. And then down here, player 2 switches. Now, in this case, we're not going to do the player 2 switches, which are on the solder side, so we're not going to wire any of these up. we're only going to wire switches to the buttons for player 1. Okay, we're going to wire the joystick for player 1, the joystick for player 1, and the joystick for player 2, but the buttons, we're only mapping the buttons for player 1. All right, so I have these sheets. I'll put it here so you can take a freeze frame and screenshot capture this in case you need to use it for a reference. And then once again, you can find this JAMMA Harness thing out on the internet. I'll put a link to one of them out there in my description. Or you just copy and paste this into a document. So that information, now if I turn this control panel over, you saw it earlier, but now you're going to see where it's got markings all over it. So I took my Sharpie, and remember this is all flipped, so now it's all inverse. So when I'm hooking up my JAMMA Harness connectors, so this is my JAMMA Harness, all these connectors right here. I don't want to keep flipping the board over, so I wrote down what all these are. So this is joystick for player 2, joystick for player 1. But you got player 1 over there, but if you flip the board the way it really needs to be, here's joystick for player 1, joystick for player 2. So you flip these around, okay? Also, which is tricky, if you go, here's your switches right, here's your switch left, right here's your left, there's your right, there's your down, and then there's your up. You got to remember, these are inverse, so if you push the joystick up, this on the back end is going down, and it's going to hit this switch. So up is really down here. If I go down, it forces the back end to go up, and that's here. So I went in, the first thing I did is I marked all these. So this was up, right, down, left. This is the reverse button, player 1, player 2. And then I did, this is down, right, up, left. And then this is the hyperspace, then Visio, smart bomb, thrust, and fire. So then the next thing I did is I went to each of the switches, and I'm like, remember we're only going to use player 1, so it's switch 1, okay? And then which pin? So remember we said fire was going to be player 1, switch 1. So it's switch 1. And I said thrust was going to be player 1, switch 3. So it's SW3. Smart bomb is player 1, switch 2. So there's switch 2, and then Visio switch 6. Hyperspace is switch 5, and reverse is switch 4. And then I took that and I went ahead down here to this mapping and said, well, switch 1 is really pin 22. Switch 3 is pin 24. Switch 2 is pin 23. Switch 6 is pin 11. Switch 5 is pin 26. And then switch 4 is pin 25. And up here, player 1 is pin 17. And then player 2 is pin U, which is on the other side. It's on the, not the component, it's on the solder side. So, by the way, your joystick 2 is on the solder side, and then the player 2 is on the solder side. Other than that, we'll just be using the component side. So, real quick, what that means is, here's your 1901 board. All these are the component side. That's the solder side, because they're soldered in here. So these have contacts here. These are your solder side connectors, and these are your component side connectors. And then the connector that goes in there, it's got connectors for the top and the bottom. So one's a connector for the component, and one's a connector for the solder. So it's a double-sided connector. Now, the one that comes from Shane, this is all in Korean. I couldn't read it. So I just put some tape over here and then made some comments to myself. So this is the solder side. And so this is pin 11, pin 10, pin 11, pin 14, 15, 20, 24, just to give me some references. And then this is the parts side. And this is pin 10, 11, 14, 15, 20, and 24. Just to give me some reference when I go to figure out which wire I need to plug into what. So this is your wiring harness or your wiring loom, and there's your connector for the JAMMA harness. And by the way, these are all the 5 volts and 12 volts in ground. They get plugged in here to the short side. So it's going to get plugged in like that. So see where I got part side right there, and it's going to marry up with the part side there. So it's going to plug in like that. Okay. Now I'm not going to spend any time filming me connecting these wires to the different buttons and everything. You can watch Shane's video on that. It shows you how to do that, but I'll come back and show you when this is all completed. But I want to show you that how I mark this, and he marks his too. This is just a more complex layout, so I want to let you know what it looks like in a more complex environment. The most complex you could get would be if you had joystick 1, joystick 2, buttons for player 1 and buttons for player 2, and that happens when you get into like the fighting games. But for this control panel, we're only using buttons for player 1. Now, I'm in the middle of putting my JAMMA harness onto all these buttons and connectors, and I ran into a little problem. So I want to spend time showing you what my problem is, so if you have this, you know how to deal with it. HAP style buttons, these are HAP style buttons, HAP joysticks. Their contacts right here, these pins that you're going to attach the wires to, these are 0.187 big. They're called HAP style, 0.187. There's a competing version of these, and they're smaller tabs, and they're 0.110. They're called Sanwa style. And then there's bigger ones for like your power supplies. They're 0.25 volt. So there's different size tabs. Well, this board, because I have HAP style buttons, HAP style joysticks, these are all 0.187. So I'm putting my joystick together first. Everything goes on, no problem. And I started doing my buttons, and a problem happened. And I'll show you a little picture so you get a clear detail. But these connectors here are 0.110, and these tabs are 0.187. So when I go to put one on, it doesn't fit. Okay, so these joystick connectors in the harness are 0.187. So if I show you a close-up of these, I can, you'll see that they're not the same size. So I don't know if I can get that even closer. They're not the same size. So the top one's 0.11, the bottom one's 0.187. So I contacted Shane, told him my problem, and he looked at it and said, yep, all his in inventory are like that. They're made for Sanwa buttons and HAP joysticks. So what he did is he sent me out another harness. I think it's for Pandora's box. I'm not 100% sure. But so my point is, if you're going to get this harness from Shane, make sure you're telling him you're doing it for a 19-1 board and that you need it for 0.187 buttons if you're going to use HAP joysticks and HAP buttons, or 0.110 if you're going to use Sanwa joystick and Sanwa buttons. So he sent me out a new JAMMA harness. Now this one's nice because I don't have to put that blue tape on here. It's got everything labeled already. Okay, so you'll see where it says parts right here, parts, and then if I flip it over, it says solder, and it's got everything labeled. And a little bit different too, his solder side has numbers instead of letters, so that's okay. You just got to remember if you're on the part side or solder side, part side, solder side, and then look for the numbers. So you look down here, there's 17 is player 1 start, 18 pin is player 1 up, down, left, right, and then there's your switches, A, B, C, D, or switch 1, 2, 3, 4. And we come all the way up here to switch 11, which is not put in here, but switch 11 for newer 6-button JAMMA harness games is pin 11, this button 6. Now if you notice, this doesn't have a wire in it, so I'm going to have to add a wire for that. The other thing with this harness, the test switch. You remember you need to test and select. The test switch doesn't have a wire, but I need to wire that. So I need to add a wire to each one of these. I'll do it with my solder iron, and the connector has to be a 0.187 connector. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to take some of the 187 connectors wires for player 2 joystick. I'm going to cut them off here, and then I'm going to use them, and then I'm going to solder them onto my new JAMMA harness. But anyway, so I'm going to pilfer the 0.187 connectors from here and put it on here for my player 1 switch 6 and the test button. And then I'm going to install this on the back of this panel, and then I'll come back to you. Okay, I finished installing the JAMMA harness onto my control panel. And the first thing I had to do is, here's my JAMMA harness on the parts side. I had to add a wire to pin 11. I added this green wire because that's my button 6 for player 1, which would be the Invisio button on Stargate. And then down here in test, it was missing one, so I had to install this yellow cable. And once again, I put the heat sink or the heat tubing on there just to keep it from making shorts. Now, those 2 wires, I took off that other harness I had that had the 0.187 connectors or half style connectors already on. I could have just created wires from scratch, but I just took it from that harness, so no big deal. And then I soldered them onto here and had a heat shrink to protect it. So the next thing I did was, let's see, this is a rat's nest. I went back to this little cheat sheet I had, and I put in all the colors of the wires for the different pins for the buttons on the joystick 1 and 2, player 1, player 2, and then the buttons test service, player 1, player 2, the color of wires for this JAMMA harness, which was different than the other JAMMA harness I had, and which pin they go to, and then down here with switches 1 through 6, what the color of wires for that harness is, the player 1 pins. So this is where I was using this cheat sheet, and I printed off so I could write all over it. And I used this to get my wire colors, and I started plugging in my wires for the joysticks. Sorry, I started over here, did joystick for player 2, and then all the buttons for player 1, and then the joystick for player 1. And the 2 wires I got loose. Here's one of them. The yellow is a test, the new one I put on there. And then I believe there's a white one floating around. Here it is. A white one floating around, that's the select. That comes from player 2 loom, and the yellow comes from player 1 loom. And then the last thing you do is you'll put on the ground. Now there's several ways of doing this. What I did is I started from the very end of the ground, and I think I start right here. I just start working my way around through this daisy chain to the next closest button, and I worked all the way around to the end, and I finished right here. Now I have all these extra grounds. Well, I need 2 of them. I'm going to need 2 one for the test and one for the select, that are in the speaker panel that's going to be below this. So as the harness goes into the cabinet, this will fall down. I'll be able to plug these 2 in, or whatever 2 are next to it, I'll plug those 2 in and put the ground onto the select and test switch. And so then the last thing I did is I took my multimeter and I just put it on continuity check, and I made sure I had continuity from this pin to the buttons. I tested and verified all these had continuity. And it's a good thing I did, because I had the wrong white wire right here. I had the wrong wire for switch 3. I'm sorry, I had the wrong white wire for my select here. I had chosen a white wire from a player 2 loom instead of the select. And I found that by doing my continuity check between here and what I thought was the connector on the JAMMA harness. So I was able to fix that. So I feel pretty confident when I go put in this control panel on the JAMMA harness, when I plug it all in, that everything is connected correctly. like this segment, I'm going to show you how to power things up on the bench, because once I get all this stuff in the Arcade1UP cabinet, it's really crazy and the lighting's not very good. So we'll just do it here, and think of this, instead of being on this desk, it's going to be in the video cabinet. So here's the power supply, and I attached, I've been calling this the EMI filter. This is really just a power switch. Okay, so this is a typical computer supply, a computer power cable. It's going to get plugged into the wall, and this end is going to get plugged into here. And this is going to be outside of the cabinet. I'm going to cut a hole and mount this on the back of the cabinet. So all this stuff here is going to be on the inside of the cabinet. This is going to be on the outside. This is the only thing to be on the outside. So this will be plugged into the wall. And when you want to turn your, that'll be off. And when I want to turn the game on, I just hit one switch, and everything, it will shoot power to everything else in the cabinet. So the power supply get plugged into the power switch. The power switch has this cable, and the cable is connected to the power supply. And I don't know if you can't really read this now because I've got it in here, but this is ground or earth is brown, neutral is now blue, and line is yellow. So that's how I have mine set up. It doesn't matter what these colors of the cable are, as long as they match back up. That on this switch, earth is earth, or ground is ground, line is line, and neutral is neutral. So they have to just be wired that way, but the colors don't matter. Okay, so that's how we're going to feed power from the wall into the power supply. The power supply, we're going to feed it. We got this cable for 12 volts. This can be my 12 volt out. Unfortunately, this is red instead of yellow. Yellow is the industry standard for 12 volts. Red's usually for 5 volts, but I put it into the 12 volt section, and then the ground. And then this 12 volt, move this out of the way. 12 volts going to be used to power my amplifier and my monitor. And the way to do that is I take this, and here's my splitter I got. I plug this barrel into the splitter. Now instead of one lead of 12 volts, I've got 3 leads. So one of the leads is going to go to, this is the cable, comes with the Arcade1UP cable. It goes up to the PCB. We're just going to plug one of these in here. Plug that in, and we're going to take that up to the LCD converter. And then we're going to take another one of these, and we're going to provide power. Remember we got this power supply, I reviewed it, and we got this dongle. Well, we don't need that. So I'm just going to take one of these, and I'm going to plug it into the power supply. Now the power supply is 12 volts, and we run this cable up to the monitor, the LCD conversion PCB, and that's going to have 12 volt. And then we have an extra 12 volts on a splitter if we need it in the future. So now the amplifier has power. Now power to the wall, to the switch, from the switch to the power supply, then from the power supply into the amplifier. And then to get sound into the amplifier, we're going to take this cable. The single pole is going to go into the output of the 19-in-1 board, and then these will plug into here like that. And so here is the 19-in-1 board. This is going to just plug into here, and now your sound is going to output from your 19-in-1 board down to your amplifier. And I'm just going to unplug these so I can pull this up and show it to you. So then we're going to run our speakers through the black and the red, plus and minus, up to the speakers, and that will generate our output sound from the 19-in-1 board out to the speakers. Okay? So the only thing we got left to do is how do we provide power to the 19-in-1 board? And we're going to do that through the JAMMA harness. Remember, the JAMMA harness connects up here. There's going to be pins here. Well, there's a red, a yellow, and a black. 5 volts, 12 volts, and ground. Pigtails that are going to come into here, and they'll go 5 volts, ground, and then we'll double up this 12 volts. And those connectors are on my JAMMA harness, and at that point, everything will be wired up And when we plug it into the wall, I can just turn it off and on by this back switch right here. The switch can be in the back of the cabinet. All right, here is the, once again, the power supply. And I'd mentioned earlier that this is my JAMMA control panel over here. And there's my JAMMA harness. And part of this harness is got these 3 wires with the pigtails. And there's my red for 5 volts, black for ground, and yellow for 12 volts. And these are going to go into the power supply just like this. I would put them in here now, but it's all connected. I wouldn't be able to get it in the cabinet. So, but once I get everything in the cabinet, I'll just make these last 3 connections, and we'll be ready to go. But that's how the JAMMA harness will get power from the power supply. Then the JAMMA harness gets plugged into the 19-in-1 board, and that provides power to the 19-in-1 board. That wraps up this video, part 3, that shows how to convert an Arcade1UP cabinet to use the Beyond Arcade 19-in-1 Classic Arcade Horizontal Games PCB. Be sure to watch the next video in this series, the conclusion, as I'll show you how to install the LCD conversion board, the speaker assembly board, the control panel assembly board, and the power supply components. For more automatic updates, when I add content to my YouTube channel, subscribe by clicking on the red subscribe button and ring that bell. If you like this video, then click on the thumbs up. If you dislike this video, click on the thumbs down. Please leave any positive feedback you have in the comment section below. All right, thanks for watching.